Title: The Cost of Deception. Chapter 1. The New Arrival. John Miller sat at his desk, absently tapping a pen against his keyboard, the rhythmic sound filling the otherwise quiet room. His office, located on the 10th floor of a sleek corporate building, was a picture of meticulous order. The polished mahogany desk bore only the essentials: a neatly stacked pile of documents, a silver stapler aligned perfectly beside a black leather-bound notebook, and his coffee mug placed just so on a coaster. Even the screensaver on his computer, a serene landscape of a snow-capped mountain, was carefully chosen to exude calm and control. But as organized as his surroundings were, John's thoughts were anything but. The pristine environment belied the turmoil brewing inside him, a disquiet he had been unable to shake for months. John had been married to Emily for 12 years. Their marriage, once filled with passion and spontaneity, had slowly settled into a predictable routine. They had a nice home in the suburbs, a group of friends they saw regularly, and a shared life that, on the surface, seemed perfect. But beneath the veneer of stability, John felt a growing emptiness. Their conversations had become mechanical, revolving around household chores, bills, and the occasional social gathering. Their intimacy, once a source of joy and connection, had become almost obligatory, performed out of habit rather than desire. The deep connection they once shared had been replaced by a comfortable but dull familiarity. John couldn't pinpoint exactly when the shift had occurred, but he had felt it creeping into their lives gradually, like a slow, inevitable tide. The spark that had once ignited their relationship had dimmed, leaving him restless and yearning for something more, something he couldn't quite name or define. As these thoughts churned in his mind, a soft knock on his office door interrupted his reverie, pulling him back to the present. "Come in," John called out, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The door opened, revealing Mei Lin, the department's newest hire. Mei had recently transferred from the company's branch in Shanghai and had been with them for just over a week. She was petite, with long, silky black hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall. Her almond-shaped eyes, dark and expressive, hinted at both curiosity and caution. Today she wore a simple navy blouse tucked into a pencil skirt, her attire professional yet understated. There was a certain grace to her movements, a quiet elegance that contrasted sharply with the brisk, often brusque demeanor of many of her colleagues. As Mei stepped into the office, John noticed the slight hesitation in her movements, the way her fingers nervously fidgeted with the edge of the folder she carried. It was clear that she was still adjusting to a new environment, and the unfamiliarity of it all seemed to weigh heavily on her. "Mr. Miller," Mei began, her voice soft, almost hesitant. There was a musical quality to her accent, the vowels rounded in a way that was distinct yet pleasing to the ear. "I wanted to thank you again for all the help you've given me since I arrived. I'm still getting used to things here, and it means a lot." John offered her a warm smile, trying to put her at ease. "Please, call me John. And really, it's no trouble at all, Mei. Moving to a new country is challenging enough without having to navigate a new job on top of it. I'm happy to help in any way I can." Mei returned his smile, though hers was more tentative, her eyes dropping to the floor for a brief moment before meeting his again. "Thank you, John. I'm worried about fitting in. I don't want to make any mistakes." John leaned back in his chair, his expression softening as he regarded her. There was something about her vulnerability that stirred something within him, something almost paternal. It had been a long time since he had felt such a protective instinct toward anyone, and the sensation was both surprising and oddly comforting. "You're doing just fine," he assured her, his tone gentle but firm. "It's normal to feel a bit out of place at first, but you're more than capable. If you ever need anything, advice, someone to talk to, anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." Mei nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly as the tension seemed to ease from her frame. "I appreciate that, John, I really do." For a moment there was a pause, a brief silence that hung in the air between them. John watched her, his gaze lingering a second longer than necessary as she turned to leave. There was something about her, her quiet strength, her determination to succeed despite her fears, that captivated him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of curiosity and intrigue that both excited and unsettled him. As May closed the door behind her, John found himself staring at the spot where she had stood, lost in thought. The restlessness that had plagued him for so long seemed to recede, replaced by a burgeoning interest in this new arrival. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was something, a spark that had been missing from his life for far too long. For the first time in months, John felt a sense of anticipation, a subtle but undeniable shift in his emotions. He didn't know what this new feeling would lead to, but as he turned back to his computer, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He was eager to find out. Chapter 2. A Dangerous Connection. In the weeks that followed Mei Lin's arrival, John Miller's life took on a new and unexpected rhythm. What had begun as a professional obligation, helping a new colleague adjust to the demands of their department, soon evolved into something deeper and more personal. John found himself drawn to May in ways that he hadn't anticipated, and the time they spent together gradually became the highlight of his day. Initially, their interactions were purely work-related. John would check in with May, offering guidance on the various tasks and responsibilities she had to handle. The department was a fast-paced and often unforgiving environment, and John knew that navigating its complexities could be overwhelming, especially for someone new to the country and the corporate culture. May was eager to learn, her work ethic impeccable, but John could sense the underlying stress she was trying so hard to hide. John began to offer his help more frequently, providing advice not only on work-related matters, but also on how to adapt to the cultural differences she was encountering. They talked about the unspoken office dynamics, the intricacies of dealing with clients, and even the small social cues that could make or break a professional relationship. May soaked up his advice like a sponge, her appreciation evident in the way her eyes lit up whenever she understood something new. Their conversations, however, soon expanded beyond the walls of the office. It started innocently enough. John would ask about her day, and May would respond with stories of her experiences in Shanghai, her thoughts on the challenges of adapting to life in the United States, and her hopes for the future. These conversations took place mostly over lunch, which they began to share regularly. At first, it was just a convenient way to continue discussing work, but it didn't take long for their lunches to become something more. A reprieve from the demands of the office, a time when they could both relax and be themselves. John was captivated by May's quiet intelligence. She was thoughtful and introspective, her mind sharp and analytical. She didn't speak much about herself unless prompted, but when she did, her words were measured and insightful. She had a determination that John admired, a fierce desire to succeed despite the numerous obstacles in her path. It was clear that her journey had not been an easy one, yet she faced each challenge with grace and resilience. May, on the other hand, was drawn to John's confidence and experience. He was a man who had clearly achieved much in his career, and she respected his knowledge and authority. But what she appreciated most was his willingness to help her, to take the time to ensure that she felt supported in her new environment. It was a kindness she hadn't expected, and it made her feel less alone in a foreign land. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between them grew stronger. They began to share more personal details. John spoke about his years with Emily, the life they had built together, and the subtle discontent that had crept into their marriage. He didn't divulge everything, but he said enough for May to sense that there was a void in his life, something he was struggling to understand and fill. May, in turn, spoke of her own struggles, leaving behind her family in Shanghai, the pressure to succeed, and the loneliness that came with being so far from home. These conversations, filled with mutual understanding and a growing sense of trust, became a source of comfort for both of them. John found himself thinking about May more often, even when he was at home with Emily. He would replay their conversations in his mind, analyze the way she had looked at him, the way her smile had lingered just a fraction longer than usual. It was a distraction he couldn't ignore, and it began to intrude on his focus at work and at home. Then came the evening that changed everything. It had been a particularly long and stressful day at the office. A major project deadline was looming, and the entire department had been working overtime to ensure everything was on track. By the time the office started to empty out, the sky outside had darkened, and the soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound breaking the silence. John sat at his desk, staring at the glowing screen of his computer but not really seeing it. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the conversation he had had with May earlier that day. She had seemed more tired than usual, the strain of the work week visible in the slight slump of her shoulders and the dark circles under her eyes. Yet she had pushed through, her determination unwavering. As John looked around the office, he realized that almost everyone had left for the night, everyone except May. Her desk was illuminated by the soft glow of her desk lamp, and she was hunched over a report, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. John watched her for a moment, a pang of concern tightening in his chest. She was working too hard, pushing herself too far, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed a break, something to lift her spirits and remind her that there was more to life than just work. Before he could second-guess himself, John stood up and walked over to her desk. The decision felt impulsive, but in that moment it also felt right. "May," he called out gently, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, surprised to see him standing there. Her eyes were tired, but she offered him a small smile nonetheless. "Yes, John. Is something wrong?" John shook his head, returning her smile with one of his own. "No, nothing's wrong. I was just thinking, would you like to join me for dinner? There's a great restaurant downtown that I think you'd really enjoy." May blinked, clearly taken aback by the invitation. "Dinner? I don't want to impose." John could see the hesitation in her eyes, the uncertainty. He knew she was worried about crossing boundaries, about what others might think. But he also knew that she needed this. Something to take her mind off work, if only for a little while. "It's no imposition," John assured her, his voice warm and inviting. "You've been working so hard and you deserve a break. Let me treat you to a nice meal. It'll be a good way to unwind after a long day." May hesitated for a moment, her gaze searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives. But all she saw was kindness, a genuine offer of friendship and companionship. Slowly she nodded, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "Okay, thank you, John. I'd like that." John felt a surge of relief and something else, something that sent a thrill of anticipation through him. "Great, let's get out of here and enjoy some good food." As they gathered their things and left the office together, John couldn't help but feel that this dinner was the beginning of something significant, something that had the potential to change both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The connection between them was undeniable, and as dangerous as it might be, John found himself eager to explore it, to see where it might lead. It was a decision that would set them both on a path from which there would be no turning back. Chapter 3. The Crossing of Boundaries. John Miller had planned the evening carefully, selecting a restaurant that would make an impression, an elegant, intimate venue known for its impeccable service and exquisite cuisine. Located in one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods, the restaurant was a place where the powerful and the wealthy dined in hushed tones, surrounded by the understated opulence of velvet drapes, polished mahogany tables, and the soft glow of candlelight. As John and May entered, they were greeted by a maitre d', who recognized John immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Miller," he said with a slight bow of the head. "Your table is ready." The restaurant's ambiance was designed to envelop its patrons in luxury. The dim lighting cast a warm, golden hue over everything, while the soft strains of classical music floated through the air, barely noticeable but undeniably enhancing the atmosphere. Each table was set with immaculate attention to detail, fine china, crystal glasses, and a single perfectly arranged flower in a slender vase. John had chosen a table near the back, in a quiet corner where they would have privacy. As they approached, May's eyes widened, taking in the elegance around them. She had never been to a place like this before. The beauty of it all, the shimmering candlelight, the subtle sophistication, felt like stepping into another world, far removed from the bustling, crowded streets of the city she was still getting used to. "This is beautiful," May murmured, almost to herself, as she ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the white linen tablecloth. John watched her with a smile, pleased that his choice had the desired effect. "I thought you'd like it," he replied, his voice soft and full of affection. "It's one of my favorites, a place I come to when I need to unwind or just escape from everything for a while." As they settled into their seats, a waiter appeared to take their drink orders. John expertly navigated the extensive wine list, selecting a bottle of red wine that he knew would complement their meal perfectly. May, less experienced with wine, let John take the lead, trusting his judgment implicitly. When the waiter returned with the wine, he poured a small amount into John's glass for tasting. John swirled the wine, inhaled its aroma, and took a sip, his expression thoughtful before he nodded in approval. The waiter then poured a generous amount into both their glasses, the deep red liquid shimmering in the candlelight. Their conversation started off light, focused on work, the latest office gossip, and some funny anecdotes from John's earlier years at the company. But as the evening wore on, the topics grew more personal. May spoke of her life in Shanghai, her family, and the challenges she had faced since moving to the United States. John shared stories about his own life, though he carefully avoided any mention of Emily. He talked about his college years, his early career, and the struggles and triumphs that had shaped him into the man he was today. As they talked, John found himself more and more captivated by May. There was a depth to her that he hadn't fully appreciated before, a strength and resilience that shone through her soft-spoken demeanor. She was intelligent and thoughtful, her insights often surprising him with their clarity and wisdom. And there was a vulnerability to her as well, a quiet longing for connection and understanding that resonated deeply with him. The conversation flowed so naturally, so easily, that John was almost surprised when the waiter appeared again, this time with their dessert, a delicate chocolate soufflé that had become one of the restaurant's signature dishes. As the waiter placed the dessert on the table, John glanced down at his left hand, where his wedding ring gleamed under the soft light. For a moment, he hesitated. The ring had been a constant in his life for 12 years, a symbol of his commitment to Emily, of the life they had built together. But in that moment, as he looked across the table at May, her eyes bright with laughter, her cheeks flushed from the wine, something shifted inside him. The weight of the ring, once a comfort, now felt like a shackle, a reminder of the obligations that were increasingly at odds with the desires stirring within him. With a slow, deliberate motion, John reached for the ring. He twisted it gently, feeling its cool metal against his skin one last time before slipping it off his finger. The act was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it carried with it a profound sense of finality. He placed the ring in his pocket, out of sight, but the action was not lost on May. She noticed immediately, her eyes flickering to his now bare finger. For a moment her expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise, confusion, and something else, something more cautious, more guarded. "John," she began, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But John, sensing the direction her thoughts were headed, gently cut her off. "Let's not talk about that tonight," he said softly, leaning forward slightly. His tone was gentle, almost pleading. "Let's just enjoy the evening, just you and me." May held his gaze, searching his eyes as if trying to find something, reassurance perhaps, or maybe a sign that this was all just a fleeting moment, something they could both walk away from without consequence. But whatever she saw in John's eyes seemed to satisfy her. The doubt that had clouded her expression a moment before melted away, replaced by a quiet acceptance. She nodded slowly, offering him a small, almost wistful smile. "Okay," she agreed softly. "Let's just enjoy the evening." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of conversation, laughter, and shared glances that lingered a little too long. The wine flowed freely, loosening their tongues and lowering their inhibitions, until the lines between friendship, attraction, and something more began to blur. By the time they finished dessert, the connection between them had solidified into something tangible, something that neither of them could deny any longer. When they finally left the restaurant, stepping out into the cool night air, John reached for May's hand. The gesture was natural, instinctive, and May didn't pull away. Instead, she entwined her fingers with his, the simple act of holding hands feeling both intimate and inevitable. They walked to John's car in silence, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger with each step. The city lights flickered above them, the sounds of traffic and distant laughter fading into the background as they focused only on each other. The anticipation that had been building throughout the evening now hung between them, thick and charged with emotion. When they reached the car, John turned to May, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the warmth of her hand in his, the softness of her skin, and the faint scent of her perfume, something floral and delicate, like cherry blossoms in spring. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the emotions swirling inside him were too powerful to ignore. "May," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that she might not want this as much as he did. But all he saw was the same longing, the same need that had been building inside him for weeks. "I've been wanting to do this for a long time," he confessed, his words barely audible in the quiet of the night. For a split second, May hesitated. The weight of what they were about to do, the consequences that would inevitably follow, hovered over them like a dark cloud. But then, without another word, she closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. John felt a rush of emotions as he kissed her, the world around them fading away until there was nothing but the warmth of her body pressed against his, the softness of her lips, and the intoxicating taste of her kiss. May's initial hesitation melted away as she surrendered to the passion that had been simmering between them for so long. In that moment, everything else ceased to matter. Their jobs, their responsibilities, the people they were betraying. All that existed was the two of them, locked in an embrace that felt both inevitable and unstoppable. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathless, their hearts racing in unison. John rested his forehead against hers, his hand still entwined with hers. "We shouldn't have done that," he murmured, though his words lacked conviction. "I know," May whispered back, but she didn't move away. Instead, she tightened her grip on his hand, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and desire. "But I don't regret it." Neither did John. The kiss had sealed their fate, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no going back now, no way to undo what had just happened. The boundaries they had tried so hard to maintain were shattered, and in their place was a dangerous connection that neither of them was willing to let go of. That night, as they drove away from the restaurant, the weight of their actions hung over them like a shadow, but despite the guilt, despite the fear of what was to come, John felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of exhilaration, of being alive in a way he hadn't been in a long time. And as he glanced over at May, sitting beside him in the dim light of the car, he knew that she felt the same. Chapter 4. The Secret Affair. After that night, the affair between John and May blossomed into something both exhilarating and dangerous. The secretive nature of their relationship made every interaction pulse with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. They were living a double life, expertly navigating the fine line between their public personas and the private passion that consumed them when they were alone. John, who had always prided himself on his discipline and control, found those qualities slipping away when it came to May. He became adept at hiding his tracks, ensuring that no one, least of all his wife Emily, would suspect that anything was amiss. He and May established a series of codes and signals that allowed them to communicate without arousing suspicion. They used innocuous emails about work to arrange their meetings, and John even purchased a second phone, one that Emily never saw, to keep their conversations private. At the office, they maintained a careful distance, their interactions strictly professional. To anyone watching, there was no indication that anything inappropriate was happening between them. They avoided being alone together in the office, never lingering too long in each other's presence, and kept their expressions neutral during meetings. But when they were alone, everything changed. The moments they stole together were intense and filled with a desperate urgency. They met in places where they knew they wouldn't be recognized. Small cafes on the outskirts of the city, a secluded park with a bench hidden by trees, and more often than not, in hotels where they could be completely alone. Each time they met, the world outside faded away, leaving only the two of them and the fierce connection they shared. For John, being with May was like a drug he couldn't quit. Each encounter left him craving more, each stolen moment feeding the fire that May had ignited in him. She made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years, awakening a part of him that he had thought was long dead. The thrill of the affair, the secrecy, the danger, the sense of breaking free from the constraints of his ordinary life was intoxicating. He knew it was wrong, knew that he was betraying Emily, but he couldn't stop. The affair had become an addiction, one that he was unwilling or perhaps unable to break. May, on the other hand, was conflicted. She had never intended to get involved with a married man. When she first arrived at the company, she had been focused on adapting to her new environment, on proving herself in a foreign country where everything was unfamiliar. But John had been kind to her from the start, helping her navigate the complexities of her new life with a warmth and understanding that had drawn her in. She hadn't meant to fall for him, but as they spent more time together, her feelings had grown stronger than she could control. At first, May tried to justify their relationship to herself. She told herself that love was complicated, that the heart didn't always follow the rules. She rationalized that John's marriage must be in trouble, that he wouldn't have strayed if there weren't deep cracks in his relationship with Emily. But as the affair continued, the guilt began to gnaw at her. Every time she saw the wedding ring on John's finger or heard him mention Emily in passing, she felt a stab of shame. She knew she was doing something wrong, something that would hurt not only Emily but herself as well. Yet despite the guilt, she couldn't bring herself to end it. Her feelings for John were too strong, too overwhelming to resist. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. As the weeks turned into months, the weight of their secret affair began to take its toll on May. She couldn't ignore the nagging voice in her head that questioned her actions, that reminded her of the pain she was contributing to, even if Emily didn't yet know it. The affair, which had once felt like an escape, was beginning to feel like a prison. May started to notice the little things that made her uneasy, the way John would quickly change the subject if Emily's name came up, the way he would abruptly end phone calls when they were together if his wife called, the subtle tension that would sometimes cloud his expression when he thought she wasn't looking. These moments, small as they were, began to accumulate, each one adding to the burden on her conscience. John, too, was feeling the strain, though he tried to hide it. The affair, which had once filled him with excitement and a renewed sense of vitality, was now becoming increasingly complicated. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, worried that someone would discover their secret. The thrill of the affair was still there, but it was now accompanied by a growing sense of dread. He knew that what they were doing was unsustainable, that the longer it went on, the greater the chances of being caught. One evening after another of their passionate encounters, the tension that had been building finally came to a head. They had met at a small hotel just outside the city, a place where they could be alone without fear of being seen. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of their shared intimacy. But as they lay together in the aftermath, May couldn't hold back any longer. "John," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the question she had been avoiding for so long. "I need to know about your wife. I can't keep doing this if I don't understand what's going on." John, who had been lying with his arm around her, stiffened at her words. He pulled away slightly, his expression tense. "May, I told you before, things between Emily and me, they're complicated." May sat up, pulling the sheet around her as if trying to shield herself from the emotional storm she felt brewing. "But you're still with her," she pressed, her eyes searching his face for answers. "You still go home to her every night. You still wear your ring when you're not with me. What am I to you, John? Am I just a distraction?" Her words cut through John like a knife. He reached out to take her hand, but she pulled away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. John's heart twisted at the sight of her pain, pain that he knew he was responsible for. He had tried to keep the two parts of his life separate, but now they were colliding in a way he hadn't anticipated. "You're not just a distraction," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You mean so much more to me than that, but it's not that simple. I can't just leave her. There's a history, a life we've built together. I don't know how to walk away from that." May looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and sorrow. "But you already have, John," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Every time you're with me, you're leaving her behind. You can't have it both ways." John was silent, his mind racing. He knew she was right. Every time he was with May, he was betraying Emily. But the thought of losing May, of ending what they had, was almost too much to bear. He wasn't ready to choose, wasn't ready to face the consequences of his actions. The truth was, he wanted both: his comfortable, stable life with Emily and the passionate, exhilarating connection he had with May. But deep down he knew it wasn't possible. May watched him, waiting for him to say something, to make a decision. But when it became clear that he wasn't going to, she felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had allowed herself to fall in love with a man who couldn't or wouldn't give her what she needed. And now she was left with nothing but heartache and regret. She stood up, wrapping the sheet around her as she gathered her clothes. "I can't keep doing this," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears that were threatening to spill over. "I need to think about what I want, what I need. And right now, I can't be with you, not like this." John watched her, his heart breaking at the sight of her slipping away from him. But he knew he had no right to ask her to stay, no right to hold on to her when he couldn't give her what she deserved. He had pushed too far, taken too much, and now he was paying the price. "May," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry." She paused at the door, her back to him. "So am I," she replied. And with that she left, leaving John alone in the darkened room, the reality of his choices finally crashing down around him. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The day after her conversation with John, May sat at her desk, trying to focus on the work in front of her. But her mind was a chaotic storm of emotions: guilt, fear, sadness, and anger all swirled together, making it impossible to concentrate. She had spent the night replaying John's promises in her mind, but as the morning wore on, doubts began to creep in. Could she really trust him to follow through? And if he didn't, what would she do? By the time the workday ended, May knew she couldn't continue living in this limbo. She had to confront the reality of her situation, even if it meant losing everything she had with John. As she left the office, her decision solidified. She needed to see him, to make it clear that this couldn't continue unless he was willing to face the consequences of his actions. That evening she called John and asked to meet him at a small, out-of-the-way cafe, far from the office and any potential prying eyes. The cafe was quiet and dimly lit, a place where they had met several times before, and as May sat down at a corner table, she felt a heavy sense of foreboding. She knew this conversation would be one of the hardest she'd ever had, but it was necessary. John arrived a few minutes later, his face tense and drawn. As he sat down across from May, she could see the weariness in his eyes, the tension in his posture. It was clear that he, too, was dreading this conversation. "John," May began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her, "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being the other woman, hiding in the shadows while you go home to your wife. You need to tell her the truth." John's face paled, his eyes widening with panic. "May, please," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't do this. You don't understand what you're asking." "I understand perfectly," May replied, her tone firm and resolute. "You're asking me to live in secrecy, to be something shameful. I deserve better than that, John, and so does your wife." For a long moment John was silent, his hands clenched into fists on the table. May could see the internal struggle playing out in his mind, the conflict between his desire to keep their relationship and the fear of what telling the truth would mean. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained. "I'll tell her," he said, his eyes not meeting hers. "I promise, May, I'll tell her. Just give me time." May nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She had heard promises before, had seen John dodge difficult conversations, and she wasn't sure if this time would be any different. "I hope you do, John," she said quietly, "because if you don't, I will." Chapter 7. The Storm at Home. That night, John came home later than usual, his mind weighed down by the conversation with May. The guilt that had been gnawing at him for weeks now felt unbearable. He knew he couldn't keep living this way, lying to Emily while carrying on an affair with May. But the thought of telling Emily the truth filled him with dread. How could he look her in the eyes and admit that he had betrayed her, that he had shattered the life they had built together? When John walked into the house, the familiar warmth and comfort of home greeted him, but it only made the guilt more intense. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and she looked up with a warm smile as he entered. "Hey, you're home," she said, walking over to give him a quick kiss on the cheek. "How was your day?" "Long," John replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a lot on my plate at work." Emily nodded sympathetically. "I know how that is. Why don't you go relax while I finish up here?" John nodded and walked into the living room, but instead of feeling relief, his anxiety only grew. He couldn't escape the weight of what he had to do. He sat down on the couch, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing with how he would begin. What could he say? How could he possibly explain this to Emily? Suddenly, Emily's voice called from the kitchen, interrupting his thoughts. "John, can you help me with something? The stove's acting up again." Grateful for the distraction, John stood up and walked into the kitchen. But as he reached Emily, the guilt that had been building all evening suddenly became overwhelming, impossible to contain any longer. He couldn't keep pretending. He couldn't keep lying. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice trembling. Emily turned to look at him, her brow furrowing in concern. "What's wrong, John?" John took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "and it's not going to be easy." Emily's concern deepened, and she put down the spatula she had been holding. "What is it? You're scaring me." John looked down at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. I've been seeing someone else," he said, the words feeling like poison in his mouth. "It's been going on for a few months now. I'm so sorry, Emily. I never meant for it to happen, but it did." For a moment there was only silence. Emily stared at him, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The room seemed to close in on John as he watched the realization of his betrayal slowly dawn on her. Then her expression changed, the disbelief giving way to a deep, searing pain that made John's heart clench. You cheated on me?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as if she couldn't quite believe the words she was saying. "You took off your ring and cheated on me?" John nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with guilt and shame. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step back, as if trying to put distance between herself and the pain. "How could you, John?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How could you do this to us, to me?" "I'm sorry," John repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to hurt you, Emily. I don't know what I was thinking. I was lost, confused. I don't know." "Lost? Confused?" Emily echoed, her voice rising with anger. "And that's supposed to make this okay? You were lost, so you decided to destroy our marriage." John opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He knew there was nothing he could say that would make this right. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. Emily turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. John reached out to comfort her, but she pulled away sharply. "Get out," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Emily, please," John began, but she cut him off. "Get out," she screamed, whirling around to face him, her eyes blazing with anger and hurt. "I can't even look at you right now. Just go." John hesitated for a moment, his heart breaking at the sight of Emily's tear-streaked face, but he knew he had no right to stay. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, the sound of Emily's sobs echoing in his ears as he left the house, his guilt weighing him down like a leaden cloak. Chapter 8. The Wrath of a Betrayed Woman. The days that followed were a blur for John. He moved into a hotel, giving Emily the space she needed, but his mind was consumed with guilt and regret. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face, the pain and betrayal in her eyes haunting him. He had destroyed everything they had built together, their home, their marriage, the trust they had shared. And for what? A few months of excitement? A fleeting connection with someone new? As John wallowed in his guilt and self-loathing, Emily's emotions took a darker turn. The pain of John's betrayal festered inside her, hardening into a cold, implacable rage. She couldn't believe that the man she had loved for so long, the man she had trusted with her heart and soul, had not only cheated on her, but had done so with such cold calculation, taking off his wedding ring as if their marriage meant nothing. Emily couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The betrayal gnawed at her, consuming her every thought. She replayed every moment of their marriage in her mind, searching for signs she had missed, wondering how she could have been so blind. The hurt was unbearable, but beneath it, a burning anger was growing, an anger that demanded justice, that demanded retribution. Emily decided that she couldn't let John get away with what he had done. He needed to feel the same pain, the same sense of loss that she was feeling. He needed to know what it was like to be left with nothing. She couldn't simply walk away and let him continue his life as if nothing had happened. He had taken everything from her, and now it was her turn. Over the next few days, Emily began to formulate a plan. She would make John pay for his betrayal in the most devastating way possible. She would take away everything he cared about, everything he had worked so hard to build. She would make sure that by the time she was finished, John would be left with nothing but the ashes of the life he had once known. She knew where to strike, how to hit him where it would hurt the most. She would unravel his professional life, destroy his reputation, and strip away the veneer of respectability he had worked so hard to maintain. By the time she was done, everyone would know what kind of man John really was, and he would have nothing left, no career, no friends, no wife, no future. Emily's pain turned into cold resolve as she set her plan into motion. She contacted a lawyer, gathered evidence, and began to lay the groundwork for the destruction of John's life. And as she did, she felt a dark satisfaction growing inside her. This was justice. This was what he deserved. By the time Emily was finished, John would know exactly what it felt like to be betrayed, to have everything he loved taken away. And when there was nothing left, when he was as broken and empty as she felt, only then would she consider her revenge complete. Chapter 9. The Revenge Unfolds. Emily wasted no time in setting her plan into motion. The moment she made up her mind, she contacted one of the top divorce attorneys in the city, someone with a reputation for being ruthless and thorough. She was determined not just to end her marriage, but to emerge from the ashes with everything she deserved and more. She wanted the house, the savings, the investments, and anything else she could take from John. She wanted to ensure that when this was over, he would be left with nothing. The lawyer listened attentively as Emily laid out her case, noting every detail that could be used to her advantage. They discussed strategies, reviewed their options, and Emily left the office feeling empowered for the first time since discovering John's betrayal. She knew this was just the beginning, but she was ready for the fight ahead. With the legal groundwork in place, Emily's next step was to gather as much evidence against John as possible. She needed more than just the knowledge of his affair. She needed concrete proof that would make it impossible for him to deny. To that end, she hired a private investigator, a seasoned professional known for digging up the kind of dirt that could ruin lives. Emily spared no expense, insisting that the investigator leave no stone unturned. Over the following weeks, the investigator's reports began to trickle in. They were detailed, comprehensive, and damning. The dossier on John grew thicker by the day, filled with records of his infidelity, shady financial dealings, and questionable decisions at work. Emily learned things about her husband that she had never suspected, and each new revelation only fueled her resolve. She felt a cold satisfaction as she pored over the documents, knowing that she now had the ammunition she needed to destroy him. But Emily wasn't content to rely solely on legal channels. She knew that in the cutthroat world of corporate America, a man's reputation could be as valuable as his assets, and just as vulnerable to attack. With this in mind, she began to subtly spread rumors about John's affair and his dubious business practices. She was careful, never revealing her hand directly, but she knew exactly who to talk to and how to plant the seeds of doubt. Emily reached out to John's colleagues and business associates under the guise of concern, hinting at the troubles in her marriage and implying that John's personal issues might be affecting his work. The whispers spread quickly, and it wasn't long before John's reputation started to suffer. In a world where image was everything, even a hint of scandal could be enough to topple a man from his pedestal. Meanwhile, John remained oblivious to the storm that was gathering around him. He was too consumed by his guilt and self-pity to notice the subtle shifts in how his colleagues treated him, too distracted by his own misery to see the pieces of his life being methodically dismantled by the woman he had wronged. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than John could have imagined. He was called into a meeting with the company's board of directors, an invitation he assumed was for yet another routine discussion. But as he stepped into the boardroom, he immediately sensed that something was off. The usual air of camaraderie was replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. The board members' faces were grim, their expressions unreadable. John's heart began to race as he took his seat, dread pooling in his stomach. As the meeting began, the board members wasted no time getting to the point. They laid out the evidence against him with a cold precision that left no room for argument. The rumors of his affair, the increasingly erratic decisions he had made in recent months, the dissatisfaction brewing among his colleagues. Each accusation was backed by the evidence that Emily had so carefully orchestrated. John tried to defend himself, to explain away the accusations, but his words felt hollow even to his own ears. He could see the decision in their eyes long before they spoke it aloud. His time was up. The career he had spent years building was now in ruins, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By the end of the meeting, he was stripped of his position, his career shattered beyond repair. Devastated and numb, John returned to the hotel where he had been staying since the night Emily had thrown him out. As he entered his room, he noticed a letter waiting for him on the small table by the door. It was from Emily's lawyer. With trembling hands, John opened it and began to read. The letter was cold, formal, and devastatingly clear. Emily was filing for divorce, seeking full control of their assets. She was taking everything. The house, the savings, the investments. Everything they had built together was now being divided, and John was getting the smallest piece of the pie. John sank into the nearest chair, the letter slipping from his fingers as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. He had lost everything, his wife, his home, his career. He had thrown away everything that mattered in pursuit of a fleeting fantasy, and now he was left with nothing. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave, leaving him breathless and hollow. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. Emily watched from a distance as John's life unraveled, the careful plan she had set in motion now playing out exactly as she had intended. She felt a grim satisfaction in seeing him brought low, knowing that he was paying the price for his betrayal. But as the days turned into weeks, that satisfaction began to wane. The truth was, no amount of revenge could erase the pain John had caused her. The hurt was still there, deep and raw, an open wound that refused to heal. In the weeks that followed, Emily tried to move on with her life. She threw herself into her work, finding solace in the routine and the distraction it provided. She reconnected with friends, sought out new experiences, and did everything she could to fill the void that John had left in her life. But no matter what she did, the anger and bitterness remained, poisoning everything she touched. Every triumph felt hollow, every joy tainted by the lingering pain of betrayal. As for John, he drifted through life in a daze, a shadow of the man he had once been. The once confident and ambitious professional was now a broken man, haunted by the choices he had made and the consequences they had wrought. He tried to reach out to May, desperate for some semblance of comfort or understanding, but she had cut off all contact. May, too, had been deeply wounded by the affair, and she wanted nothing more to do with the man who had shattered her sense of self-worth. John knew that he deserved everything that had happened to him, but that knowledge did nothing to ease the pain. He had destroyed his marriage, his career, and his reputation, and now he was left with nothing but his regrets. He was alone in the world, and the knowledge that he had brought this all upon himself only made the loneliness more profound. Chapter 12. The Cost of Deception. Months passed, and life continued on, though it was forever changed. Emily eventually moved out of the house she had once shared with John, unable to bear the memories that lingered in every room. She relocated to a new city, hoping that a fresh start would help her leave the past behind. But even as she tried to rebuild her life, the scars of John's betrayal remained, a constant reminder of the cost of deception. Emily found some measure of peace in her new life, but it was a fragile peace, one that could be easily disrupted by the ghosts of her past. She often wondered if she would ever be able to fully move on, or if the pain of what had happened would always be a part of her. She knew that she had done what she needed to do to protect herself, but the victory felt hollow. Revenge had given her momentary satisfaction, but it had not brought the closure she had hoped for. John, too, tried to rebuild his life, but it was a slow and painful process. He took a job at a small firm, far below the level he had once worked at, but it was all he could manage. His confidence was shattered, his ambition extinguished. He lived in a modest apartment, a far cry from the comfortable home he had once shared with Emily. His life was a shadow of what it had been, marked by regret and the knowledge that he had no one to blame but himself. Both Emily and John were left to grapple with the consequences of their choices, each haunted by the ghosts of what might have been. The affair that had once seemed so exciting, so full of promise, had left nothing but devastation in its wake. The passion and thrill had long since faded, leaving only the harsh reality of their actions. In the end, there were no winners in this story, only survivors. Emily and John had both paid a heavy price for their deception, and as they moved forward with their lives, they carried with them the weight of their shared history. It was a burden that neither of them could fully escape, a constant reminder of the choices they had made and the lives they had destroyed. The cost of their actions was far greater than either of them could have anticipated, and they would carry that burden with them for the rest of their lives.